Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. No te whanganuiatara aho, ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, ko Tom Doig taku ingoa. Hello everyone, my name is Tom Doig. I'm from Wellington. It's an honour to be here as part of this virtual extraction conference. Big thanks to all the conference organisers, and especially to Lisa Vonk for keeping everything on track. My presentation, Fire, Water, Coal, Past and Future Disasters in Australia's Hazelwood Mine, is adapted from my journalism PhD, completed at Monash University, Melbourne. It was published last month by Penguin Random House Australia, following delays due to court proceedings against the owners of Hazelwood Mine, Ongi Group. Hazelwood was written on the traditional lands of the Gunai-Kurnai, Wathaurong and Wurundjeri people. Sovereignty was never ceded. I thank and pay respects to the elders of these communities, past, present and emerging. The first half of this presentation is about coal mines and fire disasters. The second half is about coal mines and water disasters. In extraction industry speak, the Hazelwood coal mine is a void. The Hazelwood void is so large, 7 kilometres long and 4 kilometres wide, that it creates its own microclimate. The space left by 1 billion cubic metres of disappeared land can be a couple of degrees cooler at the bottom than at the top. On freezing winter nights, fog forms in the emptiness before seeping out towards Morwell. The town sits in the centre of the Latrobe Valley and is home to 14,000 people, nearly a century of proud mining history and some of the worst disadvantage and inequality in Victoria. But from the bottom of Hazelwood, you can't see anything of Morwell. All you can see is the mine. At a lookout on a ridge just east of Hazelwood, visitors can peer down into the gouge, where vast dark terraces of coal are crisscrossed by light grey roadways and switchbacks. These cliffs are known to the miners as the Northern Batters. They look half natural, half artificial, a cross between an amphitheatre and a canyon. Hazelwood's Northern Batters alone are 3 kilometres across and 130 metres high, as tall as the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and more than 3 times as long. From the lookout, it's also painfully obvious how near the Northern Batters are to Morwell Township. At the closest point, less than 400 metres. The only thing separating the town from the mine is the 4-lane Princes Highway and the grass struggling to grow on either side of it. Morwell is roughly the same size as Hazelwood Mine. Were it not for the highway, it might be difficult to tell where the mine stops and the town starts, where the void ends and life resumes. The Hazelwood open-cut brown coal mine caught fire on the afternoon of 9th February 2014. It burned out of control for 45 days, more than 1,000 hours. Workers were still putting out the last of the fire in early June that year. Toxic smoke and gases choked the Latrobe Valley, where more than 70,000 people live within 20 kilometres of the mine. Carcinogenic brown coal ash fell well beyond the valley, as far away as Warragul, 50 kilometres to the west, and Sale, 60 kilometres east. Short-term health problems included stinging eyes, sore throats, headaches, chest pains, difficulty breathing, rashes, nausea, metallic taste in mouth, diarrhea, vomiting, bleeding noses, bleeding gums, and bleeding eyes. An estimated 23 deaths resulted from the fire. The medium and long-term health effects remain to be seen. The mine fire was one of the worst industrial disasters Victoria has ever experienced. As the fire burned east and smoke plumes filled the sky, earthworker David Briggs and his partner Penny Linegar watched the front move towards Hazelwood's smokestacks. It was obvious it was headed straight for the coal mine. From years of driving bulldozers and excavators inside Hazelwood Mine back in the 90s, David knew how flammable brown coal was and how hard it was to put out once it was alight. The coal dust that coated the surface of the mine was, quote, like gunpowder. A hot exhaust pipe was enough to set it off. It was almost impervious to water. If you sprayed it with a fire hose, it broke apart into blobs of burning mud, which set fresh areas of the coalface on fire. Even a tiny fire could take hours to extinguish. David had also seen up close how, quote, feral the vegetation was inside the pit. Quote, That mine was in an appalling condition. Honestly, it was just like a forest. Big trees everywhere, plus all the undergrowth. Pine, tea tree, blackberry bushes, dogwood, pampas grass, and everything else. All you need is a lick of flame or an ember to drop onto that, especially towards the end of summer, when it's all dry. When that happens, you've actually got a bushfire on top of a mine fire. David realised straight away that burning embers from the nearby eucalyptus plantations would be blowing into the mine, setting the weeds on fire before falling into the matrix of fissures and cracks in the coalface, some of them 2 to 3 metres wide and over 10 metres deep. Once the fire took hold underground, it would burn deep into the earth, almost impossible for firefighters to reach. In David's mind, the mine fire was a proposition that could go on for months and months. There's no quick fix for any of that. When volunteer firefighter Doug Steely arrived at Hazelwood Mine that first night, there were hardly any working lights because most of the power was gone. The power lines, it turned out, had been attached to wooden power poles dug into beds of brown coal, but had not been fitted with sprinkler systems. The poles on the northern batters had burned down earlier that afternoon, taking out the power and the backup power. Then some major transformers had shorted out, causing dramatic explosions that could be seen from Morwell. This meant GDF sewers couldn't use the electric water pumps that supplied the hydrants installed around the mine, leaving the CFA crews only the piddling supplies of water they arrived with to fight the worsening fire. In large sections of the mine, there was no water at all. After taking in the confusion, Doug walked with Ken into the makeshift control centre for their briefing. Someone had set up a single work light outside that shone back in through the windows, casting deranged shadows in the otherwise dark building. Doug saw 3 Hazelwood employees running around, quote, like chooks with their heads cut off. The fire control staff didn't have any maps of the mine, and they couldn't print any out because the computers weren't working. Instead, they had to draw mud maps on pieces of A3 paper, attempting to explain with rough sketches the convoluted layout of the 1,000-hectare pit, with its 18-kilometre perimeter walls now partially ablaze, to volunteer firefighters who'd never been inside a coal mine before. Just on dawn, Doug's truck followed a GDF sewers escort to the 3rd top level of the northern batters. They relieved another volunteer fire crew that had been stationed there all night. Doug and Ken took a few steps towards the fire. It took Doug a little while to comprehend what they were looking at. There were vast banks of red-hot glowing coal and thin curtains of thick blue-grey smoke rising from them. The air scorched his face. Quote, imagine as far as you can see, the ground itself is burning. The trees are still there, but the earth underneath the trees is burning. The crew was meant to protect the clean water pump, a couple of corrugated iron sheds with rusted pipes leading in and out of them, surrounded by a 20 by 20 metre grid of generators, pipes and metal walkways. In places there was waist-high dry grass growing right up to the edge of the pipes. This was the only pump supplying water to the entire mine. Tens of thousands of litres of water every minute, piped to all the sprinklers and hydrants around Hazelwood, but the pump itself was defenceless. It wasn't fitted with any kind of sprinkler system. There wasn't even a hydrant for firefighters to plug into. Just 25 metres away from the pump, Doug's crew watched a fire burning into the coalface. Quote, when you're standing there, it fills the horizon. It's all you can see. You can feel the heat against your face. You can see the giant cracks in the earth opening up and the glowing red embers inside. Holy bloody hell, the whole hill is on fire. Doug's team had 1 tanker full of water. At full bore, their water supply would last for 3 minutes. What's 3,500 litres going to do against a burning hill of coal? Doug asked. Ken shrugged. We're just tourists with a front seat view. At the pre-start meeting, the team leader gave a speech for the newcomers' benefit. David Briggs recalls the team leader explaining, quote, it is what it is. It's going to be muddy, it's going to be dusty, it's going to be filthy and dirty. And everyone's got to chip in. If someone else needs a hand, you've got to get in and help them. If you want to stand around and be a pretty boy, you haven't got a job here. Everyone has got to be prepared to dig in and get dirty to get the job done. We'll be working 12-hour shifts, possibly 7 days a week. And we're only doing night work. There's no one to change with. We're on night shift for the whole duration. If you don't like the sound of it, put your hand up now, because you can go. No one put their hand up. The team leader showed the crew a freshly printed A2 map of the mine. It had the latest thermal imaging data shaded in, showing where the coalface was burning fiercest. It was annotated with notes like, road to be built across old firehole, no access due to road burned underneath, water leak, dangerous tree. The sun was still up when the ute driver dropped David off at a 35-ton long-reach excavator parked on the top level of the coalface, near a wide, flat patch of gently smoking coal. Aim for that hot spot, the ute driver said, pointing at a ragged oval of orange embers about the size of a manhole cover. See how big it is, chase it, dig it right out. When you've finished that one, start on the next one. We've got hundreds of these to do, so just be prepared for it. No worries, David said. He climbed into the excavator's cavern and started it up. He watched the ute drive further around the edge of the mine before dropping a second worker off at another excavator, about 200 metres away. Then the wind picked up and the other digger disappeared into thick clouds of smoke and ash. Over the edge of the coalface, just out of David's sight, dozens of month-old fires were emitting, quote, huge amounts of pluming smoke, and it was blowing over the batters, across the highway and into town. David put his excavator into gear and lumbered it towards the hot spot the drive had pointed out. I walked into it very gently and started to scratch. Using a couple of levers, he moved the digger's 20-metre arm and scooped out his first bucket of burning coal, then swiveled the excavator 180 degrees and dumped the embers onto a patch of dirt. This way, the coal fire would gradually burn itself out, rather than burning underground indefinitely. Then he spun the digger around for another scoop. The deeper he dug, the more burning coal he found. Quote, I took the top bit off, and it was 3 or 4 times as wide underneath. I dug 3 or 4 more buckets. It was all smoking and pluming, and it was another 3 times wider. It was actually a gigantic oven, 20 or 30 metres square, under the surface. David couldn't tell if this not-so-small fire actually reached all the way underneath the caterpillar tracks of his excavator. If so, there was a real risk that the digger might break through the crust of unburnt coal into the 500-degree inferno below. The whole situation was, in David's words, unbelievably dangerous. He was, as the saying goes, skating on thin ice, and 35 tons of unwieldy machinery. He reversed about 10 metres, hoped he was now on solid ground, and kept digging. David vaguely noticed the sun turning a lurid orange as it sank slowly behind the hills. It was spectacular, but, quote, it wasn't as if I sat there quite romantically, staring at it. There was work to be done. After a decade of planning, work first began on the Hazelwood mine back in 1955. 11 years later, Morwell experienced its first land disturbance. Since the start of the mining, the land in southern Morwell had been sinking and sliding towards the mine. But it was moving extremely slowly, just 3 centimetres per year. And more importantly, the ground had been sinking at a steady, uniform rate, so there was no stability issues. However, in 1966, a small bowl of land under Waller Street, Hyme Court and Billingsley Court suddenly dropped a few centimetres, enough to give residents a fright and to bend their houses' underground gas pipes out of shape. It was like the beginnings of a sinkhole that, luckily, didn't keep sinking. A State Electricity Commission Victoria surveyor, one Mr. Lewis, investigated the slip. He identified a 300-metre fault line extending from the northern batters and into Morwell. One theory was that the clay under the fault line was dissolving into the underground aquifer, creating a cratering effect, but the results were inconclusive. It was a small geotechnical mystery. Lewis christened the phenomena the Lewis anomaly, and the SEC left it at that. In February 2011, thousands of 2-centimetre wide cracks opened up along a 50-metre stretch of the Princess Freeway, just across from Waller Street. Further cracks were all the way down the northern batters of Hazelwood Mine, the largest crack being a sinkhole next to the freeway, big enough to swallow a school bus. 25 metres wide and 8 metres deep. 30 million cubic metres of soil and coal suddenly collapsed. The sinkhole and cracking were caused by a total rainfall of 54 millimetres, not exactly a freak storm. Engineering expert Tim Sullivan called it a, quote, 1-in-1-year rainfall event. Some of this water leaked out of the Morwell main drain, a large underground channel that runs parallel to the Princes Freeway and into the coal beds beneath. According to the Department of Primary Industries, quote, "It was apparent that water entering the mine batters was the cause of the mine batter instability and that there was a likelihood the mine batter would collapse. The freeway was closed for repairs for 8 months. This cost $10 million. The Latrobe City Council posted letters to residents in southern Morwell, telling them to be prepared to evacuate in the event of a major landslip. For some residents of southern Morwell, living so close to the edge of the mine was becoming increasingly stressful. Former Latrobe City Councillor Christine Sint lives on McLean Street, approximately 700 metres from the northern batters. Quote, "In June 2012, I was at home sitting at my desk and the whole place vibrated. I was convinced that the side of the mine had collapsed. I was never so terrified in my whole life. I really thought the mine wall had given way. My heart was racing. I drove straight to the police station, but they were all relaxed because they knew what it was. They told me there had been an earthquake in Maui. It turned out to be a 5.4 magnitude quake, the strongest in Victoria in over 30 years. Quote, "But that's what we live with all the time, that threat of landslips. It's like living on the San Andreas Fault." In November 2007, 2 billion litres of the Latrobe River flooded into the mine after an 80-metre high section of mine wall collapsed. The 2007 flooding accident was due to bad engineering. The batter had been cut at too steep an angle. Then, in June 2012, a section of the just completed Morwell River diversion collapsed into a mining tunnel and poured into the Yallourn open-cut mine, flooding the mine with billions of litres of water. Louis Nelson at the Latrobe Valley Express noted that, even though GDF Suez' $250 million Morwell River diversion project had met all the planning regulations and won an Engineers Australia Victorian Division Award in 2005 for the design of a tunnel under the river, bad design was identified as the reason for the collapse. Union Secretary Greg Hardy said, quote, "It's lucky nobody was in the tunnel when it failed. People were walking through those tunnels when they spotted the leak." Following this industrial disaster, for a whole year, the Yallourn mine pumped 300 million litres of brown coal slurry per day out of the open cut and back into the Latrobe River, which drains into the Gippsland Lakes. Bruce Allen, editor of the local newspaper Gippsland Times, saw this as the worst environmental problem to infect the entire region in 2012 to 13. In 2015, Wendy Farmer sat in the audience at the Mine Rehabilitation Inquiry as a panel of geotechnical engineering experts tried to explain what might happen to Hazelwood Mine once the power station closed at some point in the future. Emeritus Professor Jim Galvin was a risk management expert with a high forehead topped by a shock of white hair. "Hazelwood concerns us quite a lot," he told the inquiry. He was worried because the southern edge of Morwell was inching towards the great void of the open cut, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. "We know the department has had a lot of sinkholes repaired in another part of the area," he continued. "There's cracks in netball courts. The town has sunk several metres because of the water situation, that is, groundwater being pumped out of Hazelwood Mine, and will continue to subside for a while. It has infrastructure that's too close to the mine, and it was silly to ever put it there." Not only was Morwell sinking because of the mine, it was cracking apart. Earlier that year, Professor Tim Sullivan had been commissioned by the Traralgon Planning Board to report on land stability issues in the Latrobe Valley. Sullivan had written about the potential effects that land movements might have on nearby communities. Quote, "I cannot be explicit about likely impacts. However, I can advise that impacts could cover the full spectrum from simple fine cracking of roads, pavements and buildings, to the impacts similar to those observed with the recent stability incidents, including, but not limited to, collapse, major instability with cracking and dislocation of structures leading to either evacuation until the area is stabilised or ongoing fear and adverse emotional effects on the populace, vertical steps and or wide open cracks of structures and across roads and pavements, or sinkhole development at a range of scales." The expert panel devoted much of this third day of the mine rehabilitation hearing to discussing the vagaries of the northern batters. "The image I have in my mind of the northern batters is basically a fractured dinner plate, if you like, just sitting there," Jim Galvin explained. "One edge of the plate sits at the edge of the Hazelwood northern batters, but the whole thing is fractured. When you get a fracture in the ground, you'll get water in the fracture and, If you can't get the water out quickly, everything moves. To me, that Northern Batters area extending for a significant distance back into the town is a fractured dinner plate, and I can't give you any assurance in time to come when and how much that will move. Professor Ray McRae, engineer and hydrogeologist, was concerned that NG's plan to flood the mine could destabilise existing fractures in the coalface. Should we decide to flood Hazelwood mine, he told the board, that will raise the groundwater levels in the area, and that will have an interesting effect in potentially reversing some of the land subsidence that's taken place. These things never go back the way they started out, so it won't just be coming back to its original surface. It will create a different surface with different problems. So things like the Lewis anomaly may suddenly become reactivated, and it may not be possible to avoid that. Wendy Farm was horrified. These experts were saying there was no way to guarantee the stability of the Northern Batters or the houses on the edge of the freeway, now or into the future, especially not when water was involved. And yet Ongi was planning to make Hazelwood mine permanently safe from bushfires by spending decades, perhaps centuries, gradually flooding it. To make matters worse, no one had a plan B. Now that mining is finished, the entire 10 million square metre pit is officially worked out and in need of rehabilitation. Opinions differ on what to do with the defunct open cut. The Latrobe City Council is pushing for what it calls the, quote, Eden option, an elaborate sprawl of parkland and a racetrack, catering for, quote, equestrian, motorsports, mountain biking, events and festivals and more, while leaving the western corner of Hazelwood Mine free for the future of coal mining. This plan has not been costed. Community members have also been encouraged to propose their own ideas. Suggestions include developing the crumbling flammable coal faces into huge rock climbing walls, covering the mine floor with solar panels, filling the pit with wind turbines, presumably extremely tall ones, and using genetic engineering to reanimate ancient tree seeds found embedded within the brown coal, creating a Jurassic Park-style prehistoric forest filling the void. At present, though, a full pit lake seems the most likely outcome, although key questions remain. Does the Latrobe Valley have enough water in its river systems? Is this a sensible use of hundreds of millions of dollars of water, especially as the record drought affecting Queensland and New South Wales spreads into eastern Victoria? Will the newly created lake be swimmable, or will it be poisonous? And how stable are Hazelwood Mine's walls, especially the Northern Batters along the edge of the Princess Freeway? Retired geologist Robert Galton, who worked for the SEC for 24 years as its head geologist, has his reservations. Quote, anyone who assumes there's enough water in Gippsland to fill all those mines is living in Pixieland. Even if Hazelwood Mine can be filled, Galton still worries. Quote, if it were filled to the brim, I would be concerned about that. In a major batter collapse, there could be a mini tsunami into Morwell. All right, everyone, thanks so much for listening to my presentation. There's much more of that and other disaster-related matters in my book, Hazelwood, so feel free to have a read. You can get in touch with me on my website, and my email is tom@tomdoig.com. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and thanks.